The afternoon of November 1st, 1942, off the coast of Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara stood on the bridge of the Japanese destroyer Kamikaze, scanning the horizon through his binoculars. The light was fading, turning the Solomon Sea into a sheet of burnished copper. His lookouts had reported American warships to the northwest, moving at high speed toward the Japanese transport convoy his destroyer was screening. Then he saw them. Ships emerging from the haze, their profiles unmistakable even at this distance. Cruisers, American cruisers. But something was wrong with what he was seeing. The silhouettes didn't match the intelligence briefings he had studied. These vessels had too many turrets, far too many turrets. Hara counted them carefully, adjusting his focus, convinced his eyes were deceiving him in the late afternoon light. Forward turret, another forward turret, a third forward turret, all ahead of the superstructure. Then 2 more turrets aft. 5 turrets total, 15 guns, on a single cruiser. He lowered his binoculars and looked again with naked eyes, then raised them once more. The count remained the same. The American cruiser approaching his position mounted 15 heavy guns in 5 triple turrets. According to every intelligence assessment the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed, this was impossible. American cruisers mounted 9 guns. The heavy cruisers of the Northampton class, the Portland class, the New Orleans class, all carried 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. The light cruisers of the Omaha class carried 12 6-inch guns, but they were old ships from the previous decade, easily distinguished by their clustered funnels and outdated profile. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. These ships before him were neither old nor familiar. They were something Japanese naval, as intelligence had not adequately prepared him for, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about American cruiser design and combat capability. The implications cascaded through Hara's mind as his destroyer increased speed, maneuvering to avoid engagement with vessels that outgunned him by a devastating margin. 15 guns meant 5 triple turrets. 5 triple turrets meant a weight of broadside fire that exceeded anything a Japanese cruiser could deliver. It meant the Americans had built a class of warships specifically designed to overwhelm opponents through sheer volume of fire. And if one such cruiser was here, off Guadalcanal, how many more existed in the American fleet? The question that formed in Hara's mind that afternoon would haunt Japanese naval officers throughout the Solomon Islands campaign and beyond. How had American shipyards produced cruisers with firepower that should have been impossible under treaty limitations? Why had Japanese intelligence failed to appreciate the significance of these vessels? And most troubling of all, what did this reveal about the true industrial capacity of the enemy they were fighting? The ships Hara had spotted were Brooklyn-class light cruisers, and their existence represented something far more significant than mere tactical surprise. They embodied a fundamental difference in design philosophy, industrial approach, and strategic thinking between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy. Understanding how these ships came to exist, why they carried 15 guns instead of 9, and what this meant for the naval war in the Pacific requires going back to the mid-1930s, into conference rooms in London and drafting tables in American shipyards, where the future of naval warfare was being determined by men who had never fired a shot in anger. The world that produced the Brooklyn-class cruisers was shaped by treaties, by memories of the previous war, and by the hope that naval limitation agreements could prevent another arms race from spiraling into global conflict. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had attempted to freeze naval power ratios between the great powers. It limited battleship tonnage and established the famous 5-5-3 ratio between the United States, Britain, and Japan for capital ships. But treaties designed to prevent one kind of arms race inevitably channel competition into other areas. The Washington Treaty defined battleships clearly, setting an upper limit of 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. It said less about cruisers, creating a loophole that nations immediately exploited. By the late 1920s, the major naval powers were building large cruisers, mounting 8-inch guns, vessels that approached small battleships in size and cost. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 attempted to close this loophole. Signed on April 22, 1930, the treaty divided cruisers into two categories. Heavy cruisers could mount guns larger than 6.1 inches, but not exceeding 8 inches, with total tonnage for each nation limited. Light cruisers mounted guns of 6.1 inches or smaller, with a separate, more generous tonnage allowance. The treaty established that no heavy cruiser could exceed 10,000 tons standard displacement. For light cruisers, the same tonnage limit applied, but the total allowed tonnage was higher. The United States was permitted 143,750 tons of light cruisers, compared to 180,000 tons for heavy cruisers. American naval planners studied these numbers carefully. The treaty created an incentive structure. If you built a 10,000-ton cruiser mounting 6-inch guns instead of 8-inch guns, it counted against your light cruiser tonnage, not your heavy cruiser tonnage. You could build more ships total if you accepted the smaller guns. But would smaller guns be adequate for the combat missions American cruisers would need to perform? The debate within the United States Navy was intense and technical. 8-inch guns had greater range, hitting power, and armor penetration. They could engage enemy heavy cruisers on equal terms. But they were slower firing, required larger turrets, and limited the number of guns you could mount on a treaty-limited hull. 6-inch guns fired faster, allowing higher volumes of fire. They were lighter, permitting more guns per ship. Against destroyers, light cruisers, and unarmored targets, the 6-inch gun was actually more effective than the 8-inch because you could land more shells on target in the same time period. But against enemy heavy cruisers with thick armor, the 6-inch shell would struggle to penetrate at long range. The Bureau of Construction and Repair, responsible for ship design, proposed a solution that was audacious in its simplicity. If we're going to build light cruisers with 6-inch guns, they reasoned, let's build them with as many 6-inch guns as we can physically fit on a 10,000-ton hull. The standard for American heavy cruisers was 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. What if we mounted 5 triple turrets of 6-inch guns instead? 15 guns total. The weight savings from the smaller guns and smaller turrets would make this possible within treaty limits. The design that emerged was unprecedented in cruiser construction. No major naval power had attempted to mount 15 guns on a single cruiser hull. The British built light cruisers with 12 6-inch guns. The Japanese Mogami class, though initially claiming to mount 15 6-inch guns, actually mounted them in 5 triple turrets that were significantly lighter than American installations, and the entire class would later be rebuilt with 8-inch guns anyway. The American approach was different. The Brooklyn-class design placed 3 triple turrets forward of the superstructure, in a super-firing arrangement where each turret could fire over the one in front of it. 2 more triple turrets sat aft, also in a super-firing configuration. This gave the ship tremendous firepower forward, allowing 9 guns to bear on a target ahead of the ship and 6 guns to bear aft. The 6-inch 50-caliber Mark 16 gun selected for the Brooklyn class was a formidable weapon. It fired a 130-pound shell to a maximum range of 26,000 yards, nearly 15 miles. The rate of fire was 8 to 10 rounds per minute per gun, though sustained fire rates in combat were typically lower to allow for barrel cooling and magazine supply. This meant a Brooklyn-class cruiser could theoretically fire 120 to 156-inch shells per minute if all 15 guns were engaged. In practice, rates were lower, but even at reduced rates, the volume of fire was extraordinary. A single Brooklyn could deliver more shells on a target in a given time than 2 conventional light cruisers with 12 guns each. The armor scheme reflected American design priorities. The belt armor was 3 to 5 inches thick, sufficient to resist 6-inch shells at most combat ranges but vulnerable to 8-inch fire. The deck armor was 2 inches over magazines and machinery spaces. The turrets had face armor of 6.5 inches, thick enough to resist destroyer guns and shell fragments but not direct hits from heavy cruiser main batteries. This was deliberate. American designers knew these ships would be vulnerable in close-range combat against Japanese heavy cruisers. The armor was designed to keep the ship fighting and allow crew survival, not to make it invulnerable. The philosophy was that superior gun firepower, fire control, and tactical employment would allow Brooklyn-class cruisers to engage effectively while avoiding situations where their armor would be tested against 8-inch guns. The ships displaced 9,775 tons, standard, rising to over 12,000 tons fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and supplies. They measured 608 feet long, with a beam of 61 feet 9 inches. 4 sets of geared turbines produced 100,000 shaft horsepower, driving 4 propeller shafts. Maximum speed was 32.5 knots, fast enough to operate with carrier task forces or pursue fleeing destroyers. The crew numbered 868 officers and men. This was a large crew compared to Japanese cruisers of similar size, reflecting American emphasis on damage control, redundancy, and sustained combat operations. Every system had backup operators. Damage control parties were organized and trained to handle flooding, fires, and battle damage. Medical facilities could treat serious casualties. The ship was designed to absorb punishment and continue fighting. Construction of the Brooklyn class began in 1935. The lead ship, Brooklyn herself, was laid down at the New York Navy Yard on March 12, 1935. 8 more ships would follow: Philadelphia, Savannah, Nashville, Phoenix, Boise, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena. All 9 were completed between 1937 and 1939. The Imperial Japanese Navy had known about the Brooklyn-class cruisers since their construction. Japanese naval attachés in the United States filed reports. Intelligence officers studied photographs published in American naval journals. The ships were not secret. Their existence was openly acknowledged. But knowing a ship exists and understanding what it represents are entirely different matters. Japanese naval intelligence classified the Brooklyn class as light cruisers mounting 15 6-inch guns. This was factually accurate, but the classification system itself revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what these ships meant operationally. In Japanese naval thinking, light cruisers were screening vessels, ships that protected the main battle line, engaged enemy destroyers, and performed reconnaissance. They were not expected to fight decisive engagements against enemy heavy cruisers. The Japanese had built their own light cruisers according to different priorities. The Sendai class, completed in the early 1920s, displaced 5,500 tons and mounted 7 5.5-inch guns. They were fast, reaching 35 knots, designed for torpedo attacks and destroyer screening. The Nagara class, slightly larger, carried 7 5.5-inch guns and 8 24-inch torpedo tubes. Speed and torpedo armament defined Japanese light cruiser design, not gun firepower. When Japan began modernizing its cruiser force in the mid-1930s, the focus remained on heavy cruisers. The Mogami class represented Japan's attempt to maximize firepower within treaty limits. Initially completed with 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, the Mogamis were designed from the start to be converted to 8-inch guns if treaties lapsed. The turrets were built to accept either caliber. The barbettes were sized for the larger guns. The entire class would be rebuilt with 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets between 1939 and 1940. This revealed the Japanese Navy's actual priorities. Given the choice between 15 6-inch guns and 10 8-inch guns on the same hull, they chose the heavier guns. The assumption was that gun-to-gun combat would occur at ranges where the 8-inch shell's superior penetration and hitting power would be decisive. Rapid fire and volume of shells were considered less important than the ability to punch through enemy armor. American thinking had evolved differently. The Brooklyn class was designed specifically to counter the Japanese Mogami class, as originally configured with 15 6-inch guns. When intelligence reached Washington that Japan was building light cruisers with 15 guns, The response was to build American light cruisers with equally heavy armament. The fact that Japan later converted the Mogamis to heavy cruisers didn't change American procurement decisions already made. But there was a deeper philosophical difference at work. American naval doctrine emphasized fire control, radar-directed gunnery, and overwhelming firepower. The Brooklyn class embodied this approach. Each ship carried the most advanced fire control systems available in the late 1930s. The Mark 34 gun director, mounted high on the superstructure, used optical rangefinders with a 46-foot base length to determine target range and bearing. Computer systems calculated firing solutions, accounting for ship motion, target motion, wind, and projectile ballistics. When radar became available in 1941 and 1942, Brooklyn-class cruisers were among the first to receive the new technology. The SG surface search radar could detect ships at ranges exceeding 20 miles in good conditions. The Mark 8 fire control radar allowed gunnery solutions even when targets were obscured by darkness, rain, or smoke. This gave American cruisers an enormous advantage in night combat, where Japanese ships relied on optical rangefinders and superior crew training. The doctrine for employing Brooklyn-class cruisers reflected their design strengths. They would operate with carrier task forces, providing anti-aircraft defense with their 15 main battery guns, capable of firing proximity-fused shells against aircraft. They would screen battleships from destroyer attack. They would engage enemy light forces, destroyers, light cruisers, armed merchant ships with overwhelming gun firepower, and if forced into combat against heavy cruisers, they would use superior fire control, radar, and rapid fire to land more shells on target than the enemy could return. Japanese doctrine had no equivalent concept. Their light cruisers were designed for speed and torpedo attack. Their heavy cruisers were designed for gun duels at long range, using superior optics and crew training. The idea of a light cruiser that could outshoot a heavy cruiser through sheer volume of fire was foreign to their operational thinking. When Brooklyn-class ships began appearing in combat in 1942, Japanese commanders had to improvise responses to a type of vessel their doctrine had not anticipated. The crew training aboard Brooklyn-class cruisers reflected American industrial and educational advantages. Gun crews trained constantly on loading drills, working to reduce the time between shots. Fire control teams practiced tracking targets and calculating firing solutions. Damage control parties rehearsed fighting fires, controlling flooding, and maintaining combat capability after taking hits. The emphasis was on sustained operations, on keeping the ship fighting even after battle damage. Japanese cruiser crews trained with equal dedication, but their training emphasized different skills. Navigation in restricted waters, torpedo attacks at night, gun duels at extreme range using superior optics. The assumption was that individual crew quality and tactical excellence would compensate for any material disadvantages. This assumption would be tested repeatedly in the waters off Guadalcanal. The first major engagement involving Brooklyn-class cruisers against Japanese forces occurred during the Guadalcanal campaign in the second half of 1942. The cruiser Boise and the cruiser Helena, both Brooklyn-class ships, participated in multiple night actions where their firepower proved devastating against Japanese destroyer forces. On the night of October 11th through 12th, 1942, during the Battle of Cape Esperance, Helena detected Japanese ships on her SG radar at ranges where visual spotting was impossible in the darkness. Her fire control team tracked the targets and prepared firing solutions. When American forces opened fire, Helena's 15 6-inch guns joined the bombardment. The volume of fire from a single Brooklyn-class cruiser equaled or exceeded that of multiple conventional light cruisers firing together. Japanese destroyer captain Tameichi Hara, who had seen Brooklyn-class cruisers earlier, experienced their firepower firsthand during subsequent actions. In his post-war memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, he described the experience of being on the receiving end of American cruiser fire. The shells came in salvos so large and so rapid that individual impacts blurred together into continuous explosions. The American radar-directed fire found targets in darkness where Japanese optical rangefinders struggled. Ships that the Japanese couldn't see were landing shells with disturbing accuracy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of Columbangara on the night of July 12 through 13, 1943, demonstrated the tactical reality Brooklyn-class cruisers created. 3 American light cruisers, including the Honolulu and St. Louis, both Brooklyn-class ships, engaged Japanese forces, attempting to reinforce their garrison. The American cruisers, guided by radar and protected by destroyers, delivered sustained rapid fire against Japanese vessels. The Japanese force included the cruiser Jintsu, mounting 7 5.5-inch guns, and multiple destroyers with their powerful Type 93 long-lance torpedoes. In the gun duel that developed, Jintsu was overwhelmed by American firepower. Multiple shells struck her superstructure, bridge, and hull. Fires broke out. Her steering failed. Within minutes of the opening salvos, she was out of action, dead in the water and burning. She would sink before dawn with heavy loss of life, including her commander. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound. They had trained for night combat. They had superior torpedoes. Their crews were experienced. Yet American cruisers, using radar and overwhelming gunfire power, had destroyed their light cruiser before Japanese torpedoes could be effectively employed. The technological and material advantages the Americans possessed negated traditional Japanese tactical advantages. Reports from Japanese survivors and captured documents revealed the assessment spreading through the combined fleet. American cruisers were more heavily armed than intelligence had indicated. Their radar allowed engagement at ranges and in conditions where Japanese ships were effectively blind. Their fire control produced rapid, accurate salvos that overwhelmed targets. And there seemed to be an endless supply of these ships. Every time Japanese forces engaged, more American cruisers appeared. This last point touched on the deeper reality. The United States had built 9 Brooklyn-class cruisers. They then built 10 Cleveland-class light cruisers, an improved design also mounting 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, between 1942 and 1944. By 1944, an additional 17 Cleveland-class ships were under construction or completed. The Americans were producing light cruisers faster than Japan could sink them, and each new cruiser mounted more guns than Japanese light cruisers carried. The mathematics of naval combat were unforgiving. In a gun duel between a Brooklyn-class cruiser with 15 6-inch guns and a Japanese light cruiser with 7 5.5-inch guns, the American ship could deliver more than twice the weight of shell per minute. If both ships had equal fire control accuracy, the American ship would land twice as many hits. In practice, American radar fire control meant the accuracy advantage also favored the United States. Japanese heavy cruisers with 10 8-inch guns had superior hitting power per shell, but their rate of fire was slower. A Brooklyn-class cruiser firing 8 rounds per minute per gun from all 15 guns delivered 120 shells per minute. A Japanese heavy cruiser firing 3 rounds per minute per gun from 10 guns delivered 30 shells per minute. The Brooklyn could fire 4 times as many shells in the same period. The existence and combat employment of Brooklyn-class cruisers forced Japanese naval commanders to confront uncomfortable truths about American industrial capacity and design philosophy. These ships represented an approach to naval warfare that was fundamentally different from Japanese practice and more suited to the kind of war actually being fought in the Pacific. American cruisers were designed as components of a larger system. They operated with destroyers providing anti-submarine screening. They coordinated with aircraft from carriers providing reconnaissance and air cover. They used radar to detect and track targets beyond visual range. They relied on superior fire control computers to achieve first salvo hits. The individual ship was less important than the integrated combat system it belonged to. Japanese cruisers were designed as individual combatants. They emphasized superior optical equipment, highly trained crews, and powerful torpedo armament. The expectation was that individual ship quality and crew excellence would prove decisive in combat. This worked when facing opponents with similar or inferior equipment, as in the early war period against Allied forces in Southeast Asia. It failed when facing opponents with superior technology integrated into a comprehensive combat system. The 15 guns of the Brooklyn class symbolized this difference. Those guns weren't just weapons. They were part of a fire control system that included radar detection, computer-calculated firing solutions, and proximity-fused shells. They were supplied by magazines organized for rapid reloading. They were maintained by trained specialists with access to spare parts and repair facilities. They were operated by crews who had trained together for months on realistic drills. The entire system was designed for sustained, high-volume fire in extended combat operations. Japanese light cruisers mounting 7 or 8 guns assumed that combat would be brief. Violent encounters decided by superior torpedo attacks and accurate gunfire from highly trained crews. Extended gunnery duels, where volume of fire mattered more than individual shot accuracy, were not part of the doctrine. When such duels occurred, as they increasingly did in the Solomons campaign, Japanese ships were at a systematic disadvantage. By 1943, Japanese naval intelligence had updated their assessments of American cruiser capabilities. Reports acknowledged that Brooklyn-class ships mounted 15 6-inch guns, that their radar-directed fire control was radar brolosia, superior to Japanese optical systems in night combat, and that their volume of fire was overwhelming to lighter Japanese vessels. But this knowledge came too late to influence Japanese shipbuilding programs, which were already committed to other priorities. Japan had no capacity to build equivalent vessels. The shipyards were fully occupied building carriers, battleships, and destroyers to replace losses. The industrial base couldn't support a major cruiser construction program while simultaneously building aircraft, training crews, and supplying existing forces. Even if Japan had started building Brooklyn equivalents in 1943, they wouldn't have been completed before the war ended. The naval war in the Pacific had become a contest between American industrial production and Japanese combat skill. For a time in early 1942, Japanese skill had appeared sufficient to overcome American material advantages. By late 1942 and into 1943, as American production reached full capacity and American forces gained combat experience, the material advantage became insurmountable. Brooklyn-class cruisers embodied this reality. They were good ships, well-designed, powerfully armed, effectively employed, but they weren't technological marvels. They were the product of industrial capacity applied systematically to a military problem. America could build 9 of them, then build 27 improved Cleveland-class ships, then build dozens of Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, all while simultaneously producing hundreds of destroyers, dozens of carriers, and thousands of aircraft. Japan couldn't match this production. They could build excellent individual ships with highly trained crews, but they couldn't replace losses at the rate American industry produced new vessels. Every Japanese cruiser sunk represented a significant loss of combat capability. Every American cruiser sunk was replaced by 2 more within months. The mathematics were inexorable. The Brooklyn-class cruisers continued their combat service throughout the Pacific War, participating in operations from the Solomons to the Philippines to Okinawa. Their service records reveal both the effectiveness of their design and the brutal reality of naval combat in the latter half of World War II. Helena was sunk on July 6, 1943, during the Battle of Kula Gulf. Japanese destroyers launched Type 93 torpedoes in a night action, and 3 struck Helena's hull. The explosions broke the ship's back. She sank in less than 20 minutes, taking 168 men with her. The survivors, nearly 900 men floating in the water, were mostly rescued by American destroyers, though some spent days on Japanese-held islands before being evacuated. Helena's loss demonstrated that 15 6-inch guns couldn't protect against torpedoes, and that Japanese destroyers remained deadly opponents in close-range night combat. Honolulu survived the war despite taking significant damage on multiple occasions. On July 20th, 1943, during the Battle of Columbangara, a Japanese torpedo struck her bow, blowing off everything forward of the first turret. She made it back to port and was repaired. On October 17th, 1944, she was torpedoed again by a Japanese submarine, suffering additional damage. Each time, she was repaired and returned to service, testament to American industrial capacity and the robust damage control capabilities built into her design. Savannah suffered one of the most dramatic hits any Brooklyn-class ship endured. On September 11, 1943, during the Allied landings at Salerno, Italy, a German Fritz X radio-controlled glide bomb struck her third turret. The bomb penetrated the turret roof, passed through the turret into the handling room below, and detonated inside the ship. The explosion killed 197 men, wounded more, and started massive fires. The ship's damage control parties fought for hours to save her. They succeeded. Savannah survived, was repaired, and returned to combat operations. St. Louis served in more engagements than almost any other American cruiser. She participated in the Battle of Columbangara, the bombardment of New Georgia, operations in the Marshall Islands, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and numerous shore bombardment missions. She was hit by a Kamikaze aircraft off Lingayen Gulf in January 1945, suffering damage and casualties, but remaining operational. By the war's end, St. Louis had earned 11 battle stars, among the highest awards for any American cruiser. Boise fought in the Battle of Cape Esperance, where she was hit by Japanese shells that penetrated her hull and caused serious fires in her forward magazines. Only quick action by her crew in flooding the magazines prevented a catastrophic explosion. She was repaired and continued service, eventually participating in operations in the Mediterranean and the liberation of the Philippines. Nashville served as Admiral William Halsey's flagship during operations in the Solomon Islands. She later transported General Douglas MacArthur during his return to the Philippines. Off Negros Island in December 1944, a kamikaze struck her, killing 133 men, including several of General MacArthur's staff. The ship survived, was repaired, and returned to service. Phoenix had an unusual war. She survived Pearl Harbor undamaged, fought through the Solomons campaign, supported the Philippines landings, and ended the war without being sunk or suffering crippling damage. After the war, she was sold to Argentina in 1946, serving in the Argentine Navy as General Belgrano. She gained tragic fame in 1982 when she was sunk by the British submarine HMS Conqueror during the Falklands War, becoming the only ship sunk by a nuclear-powered submarine in combat and the only Brooklyn-class cruiser lost to enemy action after World War II. Philadelphia and Brooklyn served primarily in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, supporting operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Both survived the war and were eventually scrapped in the 1950s. The service records of these 9 ships tell a story of sustained combat operations, of ships that absorbed punishment and continued fighting, of designs that proved robust enough for the brutal realities of industrial warfare. 7 of 9 survived World War II. Many were damaged, some multiple times. But American industrial capacity repaired them and returned them to action, often within months. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the lesson of the Brooklyn-class cruisers was bitter and clear by 1944. American naval construction had produced vessels that could overwhelm Japanese light forces through sheer firepower, employ radar, technology that negated Japanese advantages in night combat, and absorb battle damage that would have sunk equivalent Japanese ships. Japanese naval officers writing after the war acknowledged these realities with remarkable candor. Tameichi Hara, who rose to captain rank and survived the war, wrote extensively about the technological and material disadvantages Japanese forces faced. In his memoir, he described the growing sense among Japanese naval officers that they were fighting with inadequate equipment against an enemy whose industrial resources seemed inexhaustible. The 15 guns of the Brooklyn class became symbolic of this disparity. Japanese light cruisers mounting 7 guns faced American cruisers with more than twice that armament. The mathematical advantage translated directly to combat effectiveness. When Japanese and American cruisers engaged, the American ship could fire more shells, with better fire control, supported by radar that worked in conditions where optical range-finding failed. Japanese attempts to counter this disadvantage focused on tactics rather than technology. Destroyers were employed more aggressively, using their torpedo armament to threaten American cruisers and force them to maneuver. Night attacks were emphasized, though the American introduction of radar increasingly negated the Japanese advantage in darkness. Submarine and air attacks were coordinated with surface actions to divide American attention and create opportunities for torpedo strikes. These tactics achieved occasional successes. Helena was sunk by destroyer torpedoes. Honolulu was damaged twice, but the overall trend favored the Americans. For every American cruiser damaged or sunk, Japan lost multiple destroyers and cruisers it could not replace. The exchange rate was unsustainable. By 1944, Japanese naval strategy had shifted from attempting to defeat the American fleet in decisive battle to inflicting maximum casualties to make the cost of victory unacceptable. Kamikaze attacks represented this shift. If conventional tactics couldn't overcome American material superiority, then perhaps suicide attacks could sink enough ships to break American will. This proved a miscalculation, but it reflected the desperation of Japanese commanders who recognized they had no conventional path to victory. The Brooklyn-class cruisers participated in this final phase of the war as targets for kamikaze attacks and as bombardment ships supporting amphibious landings. Their 15 6-inch guns proved effective in shore bombardment, delivering high volumes of explosive shells against Japanese fortifications. Their anti-aircraft batteries, augmented by radar-directed fire control, shot down numerous attacking aircraft. But they remained vulnerable to determined attacks, as Nashville's crew learned when a kamikaze struck and killed 133 men. In the final year of the war, American shipyards continued producing cruisers, while Japanese shipyards struggled to maintain existing vessels. The Baltimore-class heavy cruisers, mounting 9 8-inch guns with superior fire control and heavier armor than Brooklyn-class ships, joined the fleet in numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Cleveland-class light cruisers, improved versions of the Brooklyn design with 12 6-inch guns instead of 15, but with better anti-aircraft armament, appeared in the Pacific by the dozens. Japan could not match this production. The ships they had in 1941 constituted the bulk of their fleet in 1945. Replacements were minimal. Losses were permanent. The industrial disparity that the Brooklyn class had symbolized in 1942 had become an overwhelming reality by 1945. Japanese naval personnel captured after the war, when interviewed by American intelligence officers, consistently mentioned the shock of discovering the scale of American industrial capacity. They had known intellectually that America was a larger industrial power, but the lived experience of facing endless streams of new American ships, planes, and equipment while their own forces dwindled was psychologically devastating. The 15 guns they had first encountered off Guadalcanal had multiplied into hundreds of guns on dozens of cruisers, all supported by industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The story of the Brooklyn-class cruisers and Japanese reactions to them illustrates a fundamental truth about World War II in the Pacific. The war was decided not primarily by tactical brilliance or individual courage, though both mattered, but by industrial capacity and the ability to translate that capacity into effective military power. The 15 6-inch guns mounted on Brooklyn-class cruisers represented an American approach to naval warfare that differed fundamentally from Japanese practice. Where Japan built ships as individual combatants, emphasizing quality and crew skill, America built ships as components of an integrated system emphasizing technology, firepower, and overwhelming numbers. Neither approach was inherently superior in abstract terms. Japanese emphasis on crew training produced highly skilled sailors and effective night-fighting tactics. American emphasis on technology and production created ships with radar, superior fire control, and the capacity to replace losses. In the specific context of the Pacific War, with its extended supply lines, numerous engagements, and attritional nature, the American approach proved more effective. The Brooklyn class embodied this reality in a form Japanese commanders could not ignore. These were not superweapons or technological marvels. They were well-designed ships, certainly, with innovative armament arrangements and effective fire control. But their true significance was what they represented about American industrial capacity and design philosophy. America could build 9 Brooklyn-class cruisers with 15 guns each, then decide the design needed improvement and build 27 Cleveland-class cruisers with refined armor and armament, then build Baltimore-class heavy cruisers with even better capabilities, all while simultaneously producing destroyers, carriers, battleships, submarines, aircraft, and the tens of thousands of support vessels necessary to maintain a global naval war. Japan couldn't match this production. They built excellent individual ships and trained outstanding crews, but they couldn't replace losses at anything approaching the rate America could produce new vessels. Every ship lost was an irreplaceable blow to combat capability. Every sailor killed represented training and experience that couldn't be quickly regenerated. The 15 guns of the Brooklyn class, which had shocked Lieutenant Commander Hara off Guadalcanal in November 1942, became just another element of overwhelming American material superiority by 1945. Those guns, and the ships that carried them, performed their designed missions effectively. They screened carriers, engaged enemy cruisers and destroyers, provided anti-aircraft fire, and bombarded shore installations. They were good ships that did their jobs well. But their lasting significance isn't in their combat record, impressive though it was. Their significance is in what they revealed about the nature of the war being fought. When Japanese officers first encountered these ships and counted their turrets, they were seeing physical evidence of American industrial philosophy translated into steel. They were seeing ships that existed because American shipyards could build them, American industry could arm them, and American doctrine knew how to employ them effectively. The shock wasn't just tactical. It wasn't just that these ships carried more guns than expected. The shock was strategic and psychological. These ships existed in numbers that made Japanese replacement of losses impossible. They operated with technological advantages, radar, fire control computers, proximity-fused shells that Japanese industry couldn't replicate. They were supported by a logistical system that kept them supplied, repaired, and combat-ready across thousands of miles of ocean. 7 of 9 Brooklyn-class cruisers survived World War II. They were eventually scrapped or sold, their steel recycled, or their hulls serving in foreign navies. The ships are gone, but what they represented remains relevant. They demonstrated that in industrial warfare between modern nations, production capacity matters as much as tactical skill. Technology matters. Logistics matter. The ability to build, maintain, and replace complex weapons systems matters. The Japanese officers who first encountered these ships understood this, even if the full implications took time to sink in. The 15 guns weren't just weapons, they were a message, and that message, written in steel and gunfire across the Pacific from 1942 to 1945, was unmistakable. This was a war America could win through industrial might, and no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome that fundamental advantage. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.